Today we will be talking about the last Russian emperor, Nicholas II, and the two revolutions that took place in 1917 and led to the end of the Russian Empire. Nicholas II was the last reigning Romanov, and out of all of the Romanovs, he's probably the one whose name people recognize most easily today. Partly because he was the last emperor and czar, partly because of the revolution, and partly because his family later became surrounded by myth and popular culture and historical fascination. Nicholas II inherited the throne somewhat reluctantly after the death of his father, Alexander III. So Nicholas did not appear especially eager or prepared to rule, but as the heir to the throne, he had very little choice and he felt the obligation. Now, remember, throughout Russian history, rulers constantly pursued expansion. And that's again what happened under Nicholas II when Russian interests focused heavily on East Asia, especially on territories connected to Manchuria. And that's an area near Korea and northern China. But there was another country that wanted influence in the same region, Japan. And that conflict eventually led to the Russo-Japanese War, and Russia lost badly, not only on land, but especially at sea. And this defeat was deeply humiliating because Japan had previously not been viewed by many Europeans as a major military power. So for Russia to lose so badly to Japan damaged both national morale and confidence in the government. At the same time, Russia was already dealing with growing internal tensions, as we've seen in previous lessons. Industrial workers were becoming a larger and more active social group. Unlike peasants, who were scattered all across the empire, workers were concentrated in factories and cities, making protests much easier to organize. And the war, the Russo-Japanese War, placed enormous strain on economy and living conditions and working conditions. So workers started demanding better wages, better working conditions, and shorter working hours. And then came another important turning point in Russian history. In 1905, thousands of workers marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, where the Tsar was supposed to be. They were not marching as revolutionaries trying to overthrow the monarchy. Many still believed that the Tsar would listen to their suffering if he heard it from them directly. They just wanted reform and better conditions, that's it. But Nicholas II was not at the palace that day, and he actually was not in St. Petersburg that day. And the authorities he left in charge ordered troops to fire at the people. So what began as a peaceful demonstration turned into a massacre. And this event became known as Bloody Sunday. And after Bloody Sunday, more and more people began believing that change would not come through requests or peaceful demonstrations or gradual reform. So after the shock of Bloody Sunday, protests spread quickly all across the Russian Empire. Workers were striking, peasants were attacking estates, students were demonstrating, and this unrest even spread to the military. So in history, we know it as the Revolution of 1905, even though it was rather small scale for a revolution compared to what's coming. Still, it was scary enough for Nicholas II to give in, so he announced some basic civil liberties such as freedom of speech or freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and even created the first Russian parliament, the State Duma. But still many issues remained unresolved at this point. So as these tensions kept growing inside of Russia, the country entered another enormous crisis, World War I. Russia joined the war as part of the Allied powers, the Entente, based on the previous agreements. But the war drained the empire's resources. It devastated the economy and caused enormous military casualties. And many Russians started asking, why are we fighting abroad when conditions inside Russia are already collapsing? But the decisions were still made by the monarch. And all of this eventually pushed the Russian people toward the main revolutions. Now, here is something extremely important to remember. People often talk about the Russian Revolution of 1917 as if it were one single event, but in reality, there were two very different revolutions in 1917, and it's important to understand the difference between them, because then it's kind of essential to understanding the modern Russian history and the path that Russia took. So let's talk about the first of the revolutions, the February Revolution. This revolution began with workers' protests. Remember, people were exhausted, there were food shortages, there was inflation, and basically the conditions for regular people were becoming unbearable. So large demonstrations and strikes and protests broke out all over the capital. And at first, these protests were not necessarily revolutionary in the sense of wanting to destroy the entire political system, but the situation escalated pretty quickly. And then something extremely important happened. Parts of the military began siding with the protesters because many soldiers were also exhausted by the war and very frustrated by enormous losses and poor conditions for those fighting at the fronts. At the same time, members of aristocracy and nobility also joined the movement. But their goals were a little bit different. So the political elite wanted constitutional reform and a stronger parliamentary system. And remember, technically, Russia already had a parliament, the State Duma, after Nicholas II created it as a reaction to the Russian Revolution of 1905. But many people felt that it had very little power because the Tsar still controlled most major decisions. Eventually, as these protests were intensifying, Nicholas II's close circle persuaded him to abdicate peacefully. And after some hesitation, he stepped down from the throne. And this effectively ended the rule of monarchy in Russia because the full power was given to the Russian provisional government. Now, this is extremely important again. For a short period of time, Russia was actually moving in the direction of a democratic representative system because the provisional government supported ideas like elections and political parties and civil freedoms and constitutional reform. But the situation was incredibly unstable. The war was still continuing. The economy was still collapsing. There was still food shortages, and different political groups wanted completely different futures for Russia. One of the major political forces inside this environment was the Bolshevik Party. And the Bolsheviks argued that the provisional government mainly represented the interests of nobility and middle class rather than the interests of workers and peasants. And because workers had played such a major role in the February Revolution, radical socialist ideas gained enormous support. The Bolsheviks at that point were led by Vladimir Lenin, and at that time Lenin was highly charismatic and energetic and politically effective. So he promised several things that sounded extremely powerful to ordinary people at that moment: peace, land, and real power to workers and peasants. And one of the most important promises that he made was ending Russia's participation in World War I. And at the same time, the provisional government struggled to stabilize the country because they were trying to change an entire political system during wartime. And many Russians at this point were growing extremely impatient. So later in 1917 came the Second Revolution, and it's called the October Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution or the Red Revolution. And what happened is, with support from workers, soldiers, and various revolutionary groups, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian provisional government. And this completely changed the direction of Russian history. And this is why it's so important to distinguish between these two revolutions. The February Revolution mainly wanted to replace autocracy with a more representative political system. Russia could potentially have developed into something closer to a constitutional parliamentary state or even maybe constitutional monarchy. But the October Revolution changed the entire social and political structure much more radically. The Bolsheviks declared that workers and peasants, not nobility, aristocrats, or monarchs, would become the foundation of the new system. And the new government also held its promise to end the country's involvement in World War I and bring the troops back. Now, it wasn't a very smart decision if we look at it from the point of view of foreign politics, but I'm not going to go into this here. But it was a very smart populist decision to ensure the support of the people. Now, remember how important dynastic bloodline had been throughout Russian history? The Bolsheviks understood that very well too. They knew that as long as the Romanov dynasty survived, the monarchy could potentially return. So the family of Nicholas II was first exiled and later executed. Nicholas II himself, his wife, and all his children were killed. And with that, the Romanov dynasty came to an end. Now, here is the final important question. Did the life become better or worse for ordinary people after the revolution? And this is finally when we can say better. Now, the conditions in the country and the situations in the country was horrendous. There was civil war and there were still food shortages. But at that exact moment in history, many workers and peasants who had zero power throughout the previous history genuinely believed life would finally become better for them. Because for the first time, they felt that political power belonged to them rather than to nobles or monarchs or aristocrats or landowners. And there was enormous excitement and hope and belief that a completely new world was being created as part of this revolution. Now, how that revolutionary dream developed later and what actually happened under Soviet rule is a much more complicated story, and that is what we will continue discussing next time. Thank you.